Home is where the heart is. There's no place like home, made famous in the movies The Wizard of Oz and Oz. We recently purchased and moved into another home in Elk Grove. This home is a sanctuary, and the backyard is large enough for a pool, although I feel incredibly guilty about the amount of water that's used in the pool, and who knows what the future holds when it comes to swimming pools. A hopefully slug-free garden, and lots of trees and bushes. It is an oasis of love, peace, and gratitude. I frequently count the blessings I've received from the universe that I can live comfortably with my youngest son and his 2 children. At the same time, I also consider the lives of those who do not have a place to call home. I am amazed and saddened by the fact that our country makes the commitment to spend billions of dollars to kill people in other countries, but is unwilling to make a fraction of that commitment to ensure that everyone has a home to live in. Thank you. I recall one of my clients when I was working for legal aid in Nebraska. She was a young single parent doing her best to work full-time and take care of her children so that they could have a better life. What she told me about her housing was heartbreaking. She lived in the apartment of a then well-known slumlord in Omaha. Among other things, she would wake up in the morning and would have to shake the roaches out of her children's clothing before she could get them dressed. The apartment building was ultimately condemned, but it took an incredibly long time. Home for her was not the home sweet home of fairy tales, but I respected her so much for all she did. She was working incredibly hard to make a better life for herself and for her children especially. We at Legal Aid were ultimately able to get that apartment building condemned and torn down, because even when it was condemned, he would still rent apartments. So it was ultimately torn down. Our guest speaker today is Dr. Matthew Ari Jendian. Part of the sociology faculty at Fresno State since 1995, Dr. Jendian is currently a full professor and was the founding director of the Humanics program in philanthropic and community-based leadership, teaching courses on race and ethnicity, social class and inequality, among other topics. Dr. Jendian has authored 2 books, Becoming American, Remaining Ethnic, and #Think, Critical Thinking About Social Problems. Dr. Jendian is also one of the founding members of the Faith in the Valley, Fresno, is a faculty advisor for Fresno State NAACP chapter, and has served as a board member for several national and local community-based organizations, Fresno Housing Alliance, and Fresno Metro Ministry. He is a passionate and committed social justice leader in Fresno. Dr. Jendian and I have worked together on several projects at the university. Please welcome Dr. Matthew Jendian.
Oh, what a pleasure to be with you this morning on a joyous day, and to be introduced by my Fresno State colleague, Dr. Ida Jones, and my Faith in the Valley, to be invited by my Faith in the Valley colleague, Reverend Tim. Just a pleasure to be with you. Thank you both for your leadership. My name is Matthew Jendian, and I was born and raised in Fresno, and I'm here to speak with you about the fight for affordable, safe, decent, and accessible housing. City leadership must understand what economists and sociologists and everyday folk already know, that home ownership and stable housing are key to living a dignified life and creating intergenerational opportunity beyond ourselves. The acquisition of assets and allows individuals to more effectively function and reduces their susceptibility to poverty. And as with most things in life, it takes some to get some. And the opportunities to acquire such assets have been in short supply for lower income individuals and people of color in particular. Under the Homestead Act of 1862, a federal government initiated wealth building policy. White families wishing to farm in the Midwest and West were provided 160 to 320 acres of land at little or no cost, while African Americans, Native Americans, and Mexican Americans in the West and Southwest were excluded. Between the 1860s and 1930s, almost 1.5 million acres of land, 1.5 million households were given titles to 246 million acres of land that had been taken from other people, enabling those families to build their future and their children's future by handing down property to the next generation, improving the lives of millions and playing an important role in the economic development of the United States as a whole. It's estimated that today, 46 million Americans are descendants and beneficiaries of those who received these government-granted homesteads. Blight and discrimination linked to substandard housing is nothing new in Fresno. Bill Sechrist, local historian at the Fresno County Public Library, traced those conditions back more than 130 years. Fresno's substandard housing crisis has been made in the making since the city's birth in 1885. It's a story of poverty, of racism, of urban sprawl, and neglect. The decay was there at the beginning. In the late 19th century, Fresno's Chinatown, Fresno's Chinatown on what was then the west side became a Tenderloin district. Police were bribed to ignore the prostitution, opium dens, gambling, and other vices happening there, and the lack of police presence meant slumlords could exploit people. Much like other towns throughout California, substandard housing in Fresno at first was a byproduct of discrimination. If you were white, you lived on the east side of the tracks, where the courthouse was, where all the retail and the best neighborhoods were being established. If you were Chinese or African American, you lived on the other side of the tracks, on the west side. Private property deeds included restrictive covenants prohibiting anyone who wasn't white from purchasing homes in certain neighborhoods, including Sunnyside and Fig Garden. Low-income and poverty-stricken neighborhoods are often isolated and segregated from the surrounding region and the opportunities to various resources. The Brazilianization effect of the geographic bifurcation, segregating the prosperous from the low-income and the disadvantaged, has increased in American society through the rise of gated and walled communities. In 1936, James Helming, a junior field agent from a federal agency formed under the New Deal to bring opportunity to Americans, was charged with making sense of Fresno's shifting demographics. Armenian, Russian, Italian residents were moving north. Black and Hispanic populations were growing and expanding in their place. And Helming's agency, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, drew color-coded maps to determine who would get the credit necessary to buy houses. White neighborhoods were shaded green, and black neighborhoods were shaded red. White buyers in those areas were approved for loans. The neighborhoods with large minority populations were denied mortgages, labeled undesirable. Fresno's west side was red. And in his report, Helming wrote, quote, "Almost exclusive concentration of colored races are present in Fresno's west side." He noted in the more affluent areas like Fig Garden, quote, "Residential lots were sold under careful deed restrictions as to race. If a neighborhood didn't have these restrictions, he noted that they were at risk of, quote, infiltration of a lower grade population." Click. These racially restrictive covenants that you see on the screen were a prime mechanism in preventing people of color from buying homes in white neighborhoods. And nearly a century after, Helming published his report Today, the gulf between white, black, and brown residents remains embedded in Fresno's geography. We do that better than almost any other place in the country, and it's not by accident. We have done a very good job of segregating the poor and the people of color. In the 1950s, construction of Highway 99, which runs between the west side and the rest of Fresno, destroyed more than 20 blocks of existing housing. Later, at the height of the Cold War, a former member of the Fresno County Board of Supervisors who referred to Highway 99 and the railroad tracks as Fresno's Berlin Wall. In the decades that follow, city plans and zoning ordinances kept Southwest Fresno isolated, and they catered to its affluent white neighborhoods. They concentrated wealth and development farther north. There, the city built shopping malls, hospitals, college campuses. The Southwest got slaughterhouses and meatpacking plants. According to Richard Rothstein, author of The Color of Law that you see on the screen, the geographic, economic, and racial isolation of a city's black and brown residents is a pattern duplicated across the country thanks to government policies. Today, some argue that Shaw or even Herndon Avenue has replaced the railroad tracks as the city's dividing line. White and wealthy above it, poor black and Hispanic below it. A 1970s era city planning document actually referred to Shaw Avenue as Fresno's Mason-Dixon line. There are exceptions and pockets of prosperity and poverty above and below Shaw Avenue, but still, the side of the street that one lives on matters. Redlining provided conditions that led to substandard housing. You generally don't have as much stake in the house and neighborhood when you're paying month to month. The mortgage industry as a whole contributed to that transition from owner-occupied to renter-occupied and invented the investment in those communities where predominantly people of color were living. Racism has kept some landlords from caring about their property and their tenants. The less you see yourself in other people, the less you are likely to empathize and assist them. By the 1940s, Fresno had a severe housing shortage, compounded by the fact that neighborhoods outside the city limits grew at a much faster rate than the incorporated central city areas. Meanwhile, the federal government and Fresno housing authorities began to replace substandard housing with public projects, but it wasn't enough. Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King said that the nation must recognize the urgency of the moment. And in the fight for civil rights, if the dream for equality for all is to become a reality, and in his address to more than 3,000 people at a Witness of Faith for Freedom rally in Radcliffe Stadium in Fresno on June 1st, 1964, King told the audience, "Now is the time to make brotherhood a reality." The mission statement of this congregation embodies that spirit of brotherhood and sisterhood and love for your neighbor. The California Fair Housing Act, actually, you're on the right one, of 1963 called for an end to racial discrimination in all public and private housing in the state. However, Prop 14, passed the following year, replaced the act. And Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King was in Fresno denouncing Prop 14 and racial segregation. The Fresno Bee called this march and rally the largest civil rights rally in San Joaquin Valley history. After Prop 14 was declared unconstitutional by the state Supreme Court in 1966, you could live anywhere you wanted, but the lesser priced, more modern parts of the housing stock ended up getting abandoned. And as the quality of the neighborhood sagged, people continued northward. And that same pattern is going on today. Racial segregation has been replaced with economic segregation. Haphazard northward development meant empty parcels remained within the city. for years and contributed to blight. Older homes were sometimes abandoned and allowed to decay. Others were purchased by low-income people without the means to maintain them. Despite the Fair Housing Rally and the end of racial discrimination in housing by law, discrimination in fact continued, and Fresno's northward sprawl gained momentum in the 1970s while local government struggled to balance its resources among various neighborhoods in the city. The area shaded in blue represents Fresno in 1946. Notice the downtown triangle is the main part of Fresno. The areas shaded in red show how Fresno has grown since. Before 1946, people assumed growth was good for everybody, but growth doesn't automatically solve old problems. A city's general plan, its land use policies, zoning ordinances play a role in the extent and concentration of poverty within its boundaries. As more subdivisions and shopping centers went up north of Shaw and were annexed into the city found itself having to allocate more and more resources to the northern suburbs at the expense of inner-city investment. The Bee reported in 1992 that the city had ignored more than 1,300 homes that violated basic health and safety codes, many in the older Lowell and Jefferson neighborhoods. And you can see from this slide that Fresno's segregation, particularly between whites and blacks and whites and Hispanics, hasn't changed much in the past 30 years. The darker the color on this map, the larger the percentage of white residents. The darker the color on this map, the higher the percentage of Latino residents. The darker the color on this map, the higher the percentage of black residents. The darker the color on this map, the higher percentage of Asian residents. There are some census tracts in our city where no Asians live, or no black people live, or only 1% is white. In 2005, the Brookings Institution revealed Fresno had the highest concentration of poverty of any U.S. city, a phenomenon in which 40% or more of a neighborhood's residents live below the poverty line. That's $27,750 for a family of 4 in 2022. And nearly half of all those living below the poverty line in Fresno in 2005 were concentrated in 22 identifiable neighborhoods shown in the darkest shades of brown on the map on the left. Our concentrated poverty in Fresno was almost entirely in South Fresno and disproportionately impacted the non-white population. Hence the moniker of a tale of two cities that Fresno Mayor Alan Autry used. These neighborhoods did not appear by accident. Do not be fooled. They emerged in part due to decades of policies that confined poor households, especially poor black ones, to those economically isolated areas. The federal government concentrated public housing in the segregated and inner-city neighborhoods while subsidizing metropolitan sprawl and failing to create affordable housing for low-income families and minorities in rapidly developing suburbs, cutting them off from decent housing, decent educational, and decent economic opportunities. Although the city acknowledged the desperate need for more than 2,000 new units of affordable housing per year in the early 2000s, only about 100 units were being built per year in 2000 to 2002. Something had to be done, and community organizing was our answer. The establishment of the Pico chapter of Faith in Community, today known as Faith in the Valley, came to Fresno in 2003 with the conviction that the power in people is greater than the people in power. In May 2004, Faith in Community chartered 2 buses, took Fresno Mayor Alan Autry, council members Henry Perea Jr., Brad Castillo, community leaders, clergy, local tenants on a housing tour to witness in person what conditions of misery that some of our neighbors were living in. This is what we saw. And this is what we saw: unhealthy living conditions, moldy and old carpets, broken and inoperable water and light fixtures, the presence of rodents and insects. And immediately after, Mayor Autry addressed the community and enlisted Faith in the Valley's support to create more affordable housing. In July 2004, Faith and Community created the Fresno Housing Alliance. And in February 2005, the Fresno Housing Alliance sponsored a community forum, What's Up with Affordable Housing in Fresno, at Hope Lutheran Church with over 150 participants. The People's Housing Summit was then held in October 2005. 325 residents raised voices and visions out of Fresno's housing crisis, marking the beginning of our organizing process to mobilize and create the needed change. As Dr. Cornel West tells us, change happens when enough people bring enough power and pressure to bear. It's public pressure that creates the political will to do the right thing. In 2005, some progress began to be made, but the Blue Ribbon Commission's goal of 10,000 affordable housing units by 2010 did not materialize or even come close. We've been waiting too long. From his jail cell in Birmingham, Alabama in 1963, Dr. King wrote, "Frankly, I have yet to engage in a direct action campaign that was well-timed in the view of those who have not suffered unduly from the diseases of poverty and homelessness and segregation. For years now, I have heard the word wait, and this wait has almost always meant never. We must come to see that justice, too long delayed, is justice denied. But we're on the move now." The new general plan in 2014 approved was a crowning achievement for residents, community organizers, and city leaders. For the first time in our city's history, it became the official plan for the city to have an equitable proportion of growth and investment focused on the central core, downtown, and other established neighborhoods along the bus rapid transit corridor. Other policies have continued over the last several years, so we're on the move now. You can be part of the movement by joining these key organizations that are listed on the slide and these organizing efforts. Support these organizations financially. Participate in the rallies and demonstrations. Join the tenants union if you are a renter. And let's stay on the move now. The effects of the lack of access to affordable housing on individuals and families include decreased discretionary income, increased stress levels, diminished children's academic performance and physical health, and decreased vitality and sustainability of neighborhoods and our entire regional economy. Although Fresno's Mayor April 22 housing strategy acknowledges the need for 17,500 affordable units by 2025 to meet the existing demand, we know we cannot depend on the housing industry by itself to fulfill these needs without some guidelines, such as inclusionary zoning ordinances, to ensure the development of sufficient housing stock affordable to individuals and families in our community at different levels of income. I applaud the mayor of Fresno's One Fresno vision and objectives. We do not have a scarcity of resources in this country. We have a scarcity of moral consciousness. We have a scarcity of public civic action, a scarcity of voter engagement, a scarcity, consequently, of political will to address the oppression of poverty, especially with regard to affordable housing. The Fresno County rental market is a billion-dollar industry. Every month in Fresno, tenants pay an estimated $135 million in rent, and the public and private sector landlords in order to secure their homes. That's $1.6 billion in Fresno County every year. The Here to Stay report identified 46 different recommendations to mitigate displacement and keep people in their homes, including rent stabilization, just cause eviction and protection, and the right to counsel. To increase funding available to the National Housing Trust Fund, we need to cap the home mortgage interest deduction at $500,000. If you're paying more than $500,000 in interest on your principal home, you don't need a tax write-off. And we can use that money to fund these other things. We are reminded, while the least of these are becoming the most of us in the United States today, we must realize the power of 140 million people living in poverty, low income, and low wealth conditions. And they represent 42% of the American population, 35% of the voting electorate. And we have to differentiate being pro-life from being pro-birth. Because if you are truly pro-life, then when you love people, you must hate the oppression they are enduring. You must embrace your neighbor. True care is not a noun. It is a verb that must be manifested in action to address injustice, comfort others, create social change, particularly for the last, the least, the lost, the left out, and the looked over. And in conclusion, we are reminded, I am hopeful today. I am inspired by this service. I am inspired by your presence and this congregation's commitment. I am also inspired and reminded by the words of anthropologist Margaret Mead and the sociologist Martin Luther King Jr. to never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. And though the arc of the moral universe is long, it bends towards justice. Realize that when you are involved in social change work, it's generational work. You are planting seeds for a tree under whose shade you may never sit. It's not time to give up. It's time to step up, to show up, to stand up, to speak up. Be that agent of change that you want to see in your community. And together, let's create that beloved community and a better Fresno. Can I get an amen?